Alien Girl was sweating and overheating, so she had to take off some clothes. The abandoned hangar loomed like a rusted monument to forgotten commerce on the desolate surface of Ferrix 9, a trade mineral planet long since stripped of its valuable resources and left to bake under its merciless sun. Dust devils danced across the cracked landing pads outside as Lieutenant Hank Pierce guided his prisoner through the cavernous structure, his bare torso glistening with sweat in the oppressive heat. "Move it, Viridian," he commanded, his voice echoing through the empty space. "We've got 3 hours before extraction." The humanoid alien woman shot him a venomous glare, her bright red skin a stark contrast to her flowing silver hair that had begun to stick to her neck and shoulders. "I have a name, you barbarian. It's Vela." Hank ignored her, keeping his light blue eyes fixed on the path ahead. His mission was simple: escort the captured Viridian intelligence officer to the extraction point where she'd be transported to Earth Command for interrogation. The fact that his uniform shirt had been shredded during her capture attempt was merely an inconvenience, leaving him in nothing but his tight black and white training pants. "I didn't think your planet would be this inhospitable," Vela remarked irritably, beads of sweat glistening on her crimson skin. "Even for humans." "It's not my planet," Hank replied flatly. "Just another rock the mining guild abandoned when they sucked it dry." A distant rumble caught his attention. Hank moved to one of the hangar's grimy viewports and cursed under his breath. On the horizon, a massive wall of swirling sand approached with alarming speed. "Shit! Sandstorm!" He turned to Vela. "Looks like we're stuck here until it passes." "Wonderful," she muttered, slumping against a rusted support beam, trapped in a metal oven with a human. The temperature was already uncomfortable, but as the storm enveloped the hangar, blocking out the sun and trapping the heat inside, it quickly became unbearable. Within minutes, the interior of the structure felt like a sauna, the stagnant air growing thicker by the moment. Hank wiped sweat from his brow, watching as Vela's discomfort became increasingly evident. Her silver hair now hung in damp tendrils around her face, and her military uniform, designed for the cooler climate of her homeworld, was clearly causing her distress. "Your species evolved on a cooler planet, didn't they?" Hank asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Vela nodded, tugging at her collar. "Viridian average temperature is 15 degrees cooler than Earth standard. This is..." She paused, struggling to find the right word. "Excruciating." Hank moved to check the perimeter, ensuring the hangar was secure despite their unexpected delay. When he returned, he found Vela unfastening the top buttons of her uniform jacket. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. "What does it look like?" she snapped back. "I'm trying not to die of heat stroke. Your Earth Alliance might want me alive for questioning, not cooked." Hank averted his gaze as she peeled off her jacket, revealing a form-fitting undershirt beneath. He couldn't deny that despite being an enemy combatant, there was something undeniably fascinating about her alien physiology. So similar to human form, yet distinctly different with her vibrant red skin and slightly elongated features. "Is this making you uncomfortable, Lieutenant?" There was a hint of amusement in her voice now. "For someone walking around half naked, you seem rather prudish." "Just maintaining professional distance," he replied, focusing on checking his comm unit instead of looking at her. "Storm's interfering with communications. We're on our own until it passes." The minutes stretched into an hour and the temperature continued to rise. The ancient hangar's environmental systems had long since failed, leaving them at the mercy of the planet's brutal climate. Hank found himself pacing, partly to keep alert and partly to distract himself from the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Vela had given up any pretense of military decorum. She'd removed her boots and outer uniform, sitting now in what appeared to be the Viridian equivalent of a tank top and fitted pants. Even in her discomfort, she maintained a watchful eye on him, clearly looking for any opportunity to turn the tables. "If you're planning an escape, don't bother," Hank said, catching her calculating gaze. "Even if you overpowered me, which you won't, that storm would flay the skin from your bones in seconds." "Perhaps I'm simply admiring the view," she replied with unexpected candor. "Your species may be primitive warmongers, but I can appreciate good physical conditioning when I see it." Hank felt a flush that had nothing to do with the heat. Save the manipulation tactics, they teach us about Viridian mind games at the academy. Do they teach you about Viridian biology too? She asked, wiping sweat from her neck. Because if they did, you'd know we're not built for this kind of heat. I'm not trying to seduce you, Lieutenant. I'm trying not to pass out. As if to emphasize her point, she swayed slightly where she sat, her normally vibrant red skin taking on a worrying pallor. Damn it, Hank muttered, his training battling with basic human decency. He moved to her side, checking her pulse at her wrist. Her skin was hot to the touch, her heartbeat rapid. You're showing signs of heat exhaustion, he said, professional concern overriding his caution. We need to cool you down. Brilliant observation, she said weakly, attempting sarcasm despite her condition. Any suggestions that don't involve magically changing the weather? Hank scanned the hangar, looking for anything that might help. His eyes landed on a maintenance access panel near the back wall. Wait here, he ordered, then immediately realized the absurdity of the command given her condition. I mean, just don't try anything. Wouldn't dream of it, she replied, leaning her head back against the wall and closing her eyes. Hank approached the access panel and pried it open, hoping to find something useful. To his surprise, the panel revealed a small maintenance room that appeared relatively intact. Inside, he discovered an emergency kit, and more importantly, a manual pump connected to what might be a groundwater access point. When he returned, Vela had removed yet another layer, now sitting in what appeared to be tight, elastic black lingerie. Hank stopped short, caught off guard despite himself. Before you say anything, she said, her voice strained, this is standard issue Viridian thermal regulation underwear. Not that it's helping much in this inferno. Hank cleared his throat and held up the emergency kit. Found some supplies. There might be water access too. For the first time since her capture, Vela looked at him with something other than contempt. Water would be appreciated. As Hank worked to activate the ancient pump, he couldn't help but notice how the situation had shifted. Hours ago, they had been captor and prisoner, human and alien, enemies on opposite sides of an interstellar conflict. Now they were just two beings struggling to survive in a hostile environment, and somehow that felt more honest than anything else about this war. Hank worked the ancient pump mechanism with rhythmic precision, his muscles flexing with each motion. After several minutes of effort, rusty water sputtered from the outlet, gradually clearing to a more palatable flow. He filled a canteen from the emergency kit and brought it to Vela, who accepted it with trembling hands. Small sips, he advised as she raised it to her lips. Too much at once will make you sick. She nodded weakly and followed his instruction, the relief evident in her expression as the water cooled her from within. While she drank, Hank explored the maintenance room more thoroughly, discovering a security terminal tucked away in the corner. To his surprise, it still had emergency power. This place wasn't just a hangar, he called over his shoulder. The security logs identified as Project Helix Research Facility. Military designation. Who's military? Vela asked, her voice stronger now that she was hydrating. That's the interesting part. Hank tapped at the dusty screen. The logs are in standard, but there are Viridian script annotations. This caught her attention. She attempted to stand but swayed unsteadily. Hank moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a firm hand on her bare waist. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him. Her skin was softer than he'd anticipated, with a subtle texture, unlike human skin. Easy, he murmured, suddenly aware of their proximity. Vela looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the dim emergency lights. I need to see those logs. He helped her to the terminal, acutely conscious of her body against his. The practical black undergarments she wore left little to the imagination, clinging to her athletic frame like a second skin. Hank tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but found his gaze lingering on the elegant curve of her spine, the subtle differences in her physiology that marked her as alien yet tantalizingly familiar. As Vela studied the terminal, Hank noticed something he hadn't seen before: intricate patterns on her shoulder blades, partially visible above her undergarments. They weren't tattoos but appeared to be natural markings, with an iridescent quality that caught the light as she moved. Those markings, he said before he could stop himself. They're not standard for Viridians, are they? Vela stiffened, her fingers pausing over the terminal. You're more observant than most humans, she replied, not turning to face him. They teach us to notice details at the academy, he said, echoing her earlier sarcasm. Those look like royal house markings. I've only seen them in intelligence briefings. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with defiance. Lieutenant Vela Nix Talon, Royal Intelligence Division, 7th daughter of High Counselor Talon. Her chin lifted slightly. Does that make your capture more impressive, Lieutenant Pierce? Hank's mind raced. He'd captured a Viridian royal, a diplomatic incident waiting to happen, or the intelligence coup of the decade, depending on how Earth Command handled it. Why were you in that outpost? He asked, professional curiosity overriding his growing personal interest. The same reason you were, she replied, intelligence gathering. Her eyes returned to the terminal. But this changes things. The screen displayed schematics for what appeared to be a weapon system, alongside research notes in both human and Viridian script. Project Helix, she read, a joint research initiative between Earth Alliance and the Viridian Conclave, dated 30 years ago. That's impossible, Hank said, leaning closer to read over her shoulder. Our nations have been in conflict for decades. Not always, Vela said softly. There was a time before the Proxima incident when diplomacy was still possible. Their faces were inches apart now as they studied the screen together. Hank could smell the subtle, exotic scent of her, like cinnamon and something unfamiliar, uniquely Viridian. These are plans for a planetary shield system, he realized, one that could protect an entire world from orbital bombardment. Or trap a population beneath it, Vela added grimly, depending on who controlled it. The implications hung heavy between them. Such technology could change the nature of the war, potentially ending the stalemate that had cost millions of lives across a dozen worlds. Your people claimed ours stole the Helix research, Vela said, turning to face him. It was one of the catalysts for the war. And your people claimed we weaponized it against Viridian colonies, Hank countered. Their eyes locked, decades of propaganda and mutual suspicion, creating an almost tangible tension between them. Yet something else was building too, a reluctant respect, perhaps even attraction, born of their shared predicament. Someone lied, Vela said finally. Maybe both our governments. The revelation seemed to shift something fundamental between them. They were no longer simply captor and captive, but two individuals confronting a truth that challenged everything they'd been taught to believe. The heat in the hangar continued to rise, and beads of sweat traced paths down Hank's chest. He noticed Vela watching the movement, her silver eyes darkening slightly. We should conserve energy, he suggested, his voice rougher than intended. The storm could last for hours. They settled against the wall near the water pump, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The silence between them had transformed from hostile to something more complex. In Viridian culture, Vela said suddenly, physical proximity is reserved for family, close friends, and potential mates. She glanced at him sideways. Being this near to you would be considered quite intimate. Hank felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the temperature. And how do you feel about that? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. I find human customs intriguing. Your species touches so casually, yet you become flustered at the sight of skin. She gestured to her state of undress. On Viridian, these undergarments would be considered formal attire for hot weather. Hank couldn't help but laugh. Really? No, she admitted with a mischievous glint in her eye, but your reaction was worth the lie. Their laughter broke the final barrier between them. When it subsided, the air felt charged with possibility. If we weren't enemies, Hank began, then paused, unsure how to continue. Vela reached out, her fingertips lightly tracing the contour of his jaw. Perhaps here, with just the two of us, we don't have to be. The touch of her hand against his skin sent electricity through his body. All his training, all his discipline, couldn't prevent him from leaning into her touch. This is a terrible idea, he murmured, even as he moved closer. The worst, or she agreed, her breath warm against his lips. Diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Intergalactic scandal, he added, his hand finding the small of her back. Worth it, she whispered as their lips met. A deafening crack echoed through the hangar, jolting Hank and Vela apart. The entire structure shuddered as the sandstorm outside intensified, hurling debris against the ancient facility with increasing fury. "That didn't sound good," Hank said, reluctantly pulling away from Bella's embrace. Her silver eyes, still hazy with the lingering effects of their shared moment, quickly sharpened with concern. "The structural integrity is compromising." They moved together toward the main hangar space, where a horrifying sight greeted them. A section of the eastern wall had buckled inward, creating a gap through which fine sand was already streaming in like water. "If that breach widens..." Vela didn't need to finish the thought. "We'll be sandblasted alive," Hank completed grimly. He assessed the damage with a tactical eye. "We need to reinforce it, and fast." They scoured the hangar for materials, working in perfect synchronicity despite having been enemies mere hours before. Their bodies still hummed with the electricity of their interrupted intimacy, creating a heightened awareness of each other's movements. "Your engineering knowledge is impressive for a royal," Hank commented as they dragged a heavy metal workbench toward the breach. Vela flashed him a look that was both amused and challenging. "Did you think Viridian princesses just sit around looking decorative? Military service is mandatory for all royal children, especially during wartime." "Point taken," he conceded with a grin, though the decorative part isn't entirely inaccurate. Her crimson skin darkened slightly at his compliment. A Viridian blush, he realized with fascination. Using scavenged materials and the emergency tools from the maintenance room, they constructed a makeshift barricade against the weakened section. Vela's knowledge of pressure points and structural reinforcement complemented Hank's practical experience, their different approaches merging into effective solutions. As they worked, the terminal in the maintenance room continued to download the Project Helix files, occasionally emitting soft beeps that were barely audible over the howling storm. "There," Hank said finally, stepping back to examine their handiwork. The reinforcement wouldn't hold forever, but it should last until the storm passed. "Not bad for a princess and a lieutenant." "I told you, I'm the 7th daughter," Vela corrected, wiping sweat from her brow. "Practically a commoner by royal standards." "Is that why they sent you on a dangerous intelligence mission?" Something flickered across her face, a momentary vulnerability that she quickly masked. "Expendability has its advantages. No one looks too closely at your assignments." Before Hank could respond, another beep, louder and more insistent, came from the maintenance room. They hurried back to find the terminal screen flashing with newly decrypted files. "It's completed the data recovery," Vela said, leaning over the console. The screen displayed communication logs, research notes, and most importantly, security footage from 30 years ago. Hank tapped on a video file dated 1 week before the Proxima incident, the catastrophic event that had triggered the war between their peoples. The grainy footage showed a laboratory within the facility. Human and Viridian scientists worked side by side, the atmosphere one of collegial cooperation. Then the camera angle changed, revealing 3 figures entering through a rear door. Figures wearing environmental suits that concealed their identities. "Who are they?" Hank murmured. Vela's fingers flew across the terminal, enhancing the image and running it through a recognition program. Not human or Viridian, based on their proportions and movement patterns. The footage continued, showing the mysterious figures tampering with equipment while the scientists were on break. Then, chillingly, one of them turned toward the camera, revealing a symbol on their suit, a stylized trident. "The Triarch Collective!" Vela breathed, her voice a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "The mining consortium?" Hank frowned. What would they have to gain from sabotaging a joint defense project? Vela's expression hardened. War is profitable, especially for those supplying both sides. The collective has been the primary resource provider for both Earth and Viridian military operations since the conflict began. The implications were staggering. 30 years of bloodshed, millions of lives lost, entire worlds scarred by conflict, all potentially engineered by corporate interests. "We need to get this information back to our governments," Hank said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If we survive long enough," Vela replied, glancing toward the reinforced wall where the storm's assault continued unabated. A new alert flashed on the terminal, a weather monitoring system, still partially functional after all these years. The data it displayed was not encouraging. The storm's intensifying, Vela reported. It's already Category 4 and still building. Our barricade won't hold against a Category 5. Hank ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. How long until extraction was supposed to arrive? Another hour, at least. But in this storm, she left the sentence unfinished. The reality of their situation settled over them. They were trapped in a failing structure on a hostile planet with information that could end a decades-long war, but no guarantee they would survive to deliver it. The tension of the moment hung between them, heightened by the lingering awareness of their interrupted connection. Now, Hank found himself studying the elegant curve of Vela's neck, and the way her silver hair clung to her damp skin, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. When she turned and caught his gaze, there was no embarrassment, only a mutual recognition of desire mingled with the very real possibility that these might be their final hours. In Viridian culture, she said softly, when faced with mortality, it's customary to celebrate life rather than dwell on death. Hank stepped closer, drawn by something deeper than physical attraction. And how do Viridians celebrate life? Her lips curved into a smile that contained both invitation and challenge. Through connection, through communion. The word carried weight beyond its literal meaning, imbued with cultural significance he could sense but not fully comprehend. On Earth, he said, his voice low, we have similar customs. Their bodies gravitated toward each other, the heat of the hangar nothing compared to the warmth building between them. This time when they came together, it wasn't with the hesitant exploration of their earlier kiss, but with the urgent certainty of two beings choosing connection in the face of uncertainty. Time seemed to suspend as they found refuge in each other's arms, their cultural differences fading into insignificance against the primal rhythm they created together. In those moments of shared vulnerability and passion, they weren't human and Viridian, soldier and princess, captor and captive. They were simply Hank and Vola, two souls finding unexpected harmony amidst chaos. Afterward, they lay together on the emergency blankets they'd spread across the floor, their bodies cooling in the still oppressive heat of the hangar. The storm continued its assault outside, but within their makeshift sanctuary, a different kind of peace had been established. Your species continues to surprise me, Vela murmured, tracing patterns on Hank's chest. You approach intimacy with such intensity. Hank smiled, watching the play of emergency lights across her crimson skin. Is that a complaint? An observation, she replied, her silver eyes meeting his with newfound warmth. And perhaps a compliment. The howling of the storm had diminished to a low moan, the first indication that the worst might be passing. Hank lifted his head from where it rested against Vela's shoulder, listening to the changing sounds outside. Storm's weakening, he observed, reluctantly disentangling himself from their embrace. Vela stretched languidly, her crimson skin glowing with a subtle luminescence in the dim emergency lighting. An after effect of Viridian intimacy that Hank found utterly fascinating. Your extraction team should be able to approach soon, she said, the reality of their situation returning to her voice. The unspoken question hung between them. What happened next? Would he still deliver her to Earth Command as a prisoner? Could they somehow use the evidence they discovered to convince their respective governments of the Triarch deception? Before Hank could voice any of these thoughts, a sharp alert from the terminal cut through the relative quiet. They both moved quickly to investigate, military training overriding their momentary contentment. Proximity alert, Vela read, scanning the display. Something's approaching from the northwest. Hank checked his comm unit, which had begun receiving signals again as the storm abated. Not my extraction team. They're still holding position at the outpost, waiting for clearance to fly. Vela's fingers flew across the terminal, accessing the facility's external cameras. Most were non-functional, but one flickered to life, showing a sleek vessel descending through the thinning dust clouds. Its design was neither human nor Viridian, all sharp angles and matte black surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Triarch, they said in unison, recognizing the distinctive silhouette. They must have monitoring systems still active here, Hank theorized, grabbing his sidearm from where he'd set it aside. They detected our access to the classified files. Or they routinely check the facility after storms, Vela suggested, already moving to gather her scattered clothing. Either way, we can't let them find us. Or the evidence. Hank nodded grimly. We need a plan, and more than that, we need leverage. A thought struck him as he watched Vela quickly dress. The files mentioned prototype testing. What if there's still functional technology here? Something we could use. Her eyes lit up with understanding. The research labs would be in the secure areas, deeper in the facility. They dressed hurriedly, the intimate atmosphere of moments before replaced by urgent purpose. Yet something had fundamentally changed between them, a trust and synchronicity born from their shared experiences. There should be an access point to the lower levels, Vela said, studying the facility schematic on the terminal. Here, through the maintenance bay. Hank downloaded the critical evidence to a portable drive, while Vela gathered supplies. They moved with practiced efficiency, their earlier passion channeled into focused action. The maintenance bay proved to be larger than expected, filled with dust-covered equipment and abandoned vehicles. At the far end, they located a heavy security door marked with both human and Viridian warning symbols. Restricted access, Hank translated. Looks like we're on the right track. The door's electronic lock was long dead, but the manual override still functioned. Together, they turned the heavy wheel mechanism until the door grudgingly swung open, revealing a stairwell descending into darkness. Ladies first, Hank offered with a wry smile. Vela arched an elegant silver eyebrow. How gallant, sending the princess into unknown danger. I thought you were practically a commoner, he teased, stepping through first with his weapon ready. Their banter continued as they descended, a way to manage tension as much as an expression of their evolving relationship. The stairwell led to a corridor lined with laboratory doors, most sealed shut or collapsed. At the end of the corridor stood a massive vault door emblazoned with the Project Helix logo, a stylized double helix wrapped around a shield. Unlike the other systems they'd encountered, this one showed signs of backup power still functioning. Jackpot, Hank whispered. The security panel required both human and Viridian authorization, a deliberate safeguard requiring cooperation between the species. Hank placed his palm on one scanner, while Vela did the same on the adjacent panel. It needs genetic verification, she realized. It's checking our DNA. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then, surprisingly, the panel flashed green. Security protocols recognize basic human and Viridian patterns, Hank guessed. Specific identities probably don't matter after 30 years of system degradation. The vault door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a pristine laboratory that looked as though it had been abandoned only yesterday. In the center stood a cylindrical device approximately 2 meters tall, surrounded by workstations and monitoring equipment. The Helix prototype, Vela breathed, approaching it with reverence. Hank checked his comm unit. We've got maybe 10 minutes before that Tri-Arc ship lands. Can you figure out what this thing does and how to use it? I can try. She moved to the nearest console, which illuminated at her touch. The interface is intuitive, designed for both species to operate. While Vela worked, Hank secured the laboratory entrance and took inventory of their options. The evidence they discovered was explosive, literally world-changing, but worthless if they didn't survive to share it. Above them, the faint sound of the hangar doors being forced open echoed down the stairwell. The Tri-Arc had arrived. They're inside, Hank warned, keeping his voice low. How's it coming? Vela's face was bathed in the blue glow of the console, her expression intense with concentration. This is remarkable. The Helix device isn't just a shield, it's a localized atmospheric manipulator. It can create a controlled energy field that selectively filters matter and radiation. In plain standard, please. She looked up, excitement overriding fear. It can protect a specific area from almost any external threat. Storms, radiation, projectiles, while allowing authorized entities to pass through. Can you activate it? Already done, she gestured to the cylinder, which had begun to emit a soft humming sound. I've set it to recognize our biometric signatures as authorized. Anyone else who tries to enter the field will experience resistance. Hank grinned, impressed by her quick mastery of the alien-human hybrid technology. Resistance as in mild discomfort, or as in flying across the room? Somewhere in between, she replied with a mischievous smile that made his heart race despite their precarious situation. Enough to discourage without killing. We're not barbarians, after all. The sound of methodical searching grew louder. heavy footsteps and the electronic whine of scanning equipment moving through the upper level. "Time to test your shield," Hank said, positioning himself near the entrance with his weapon ready. "And hope it works as advertised." Vela joined him, her shoulder brushing against his in a gesture that now felt comfortingly familiar. "It will work. Human engineering combined with Viridian theoretical applications. It's actually quite brilliant." "If we survive this," Hank said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur, "remind me to show you some other brilliant human-Viridian combinations." The crimson flush that spread across her cheeks told him she understood his meaning perfectly. "Focus, Lieutenant," she chided, though her silver eyes sparkled with promise. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the distinctive electronic chirp of Triarch communication devices. Hank tensed, ready for confrontation, but Vela placed a calming hand on his arm. "Trust the shield," she whispered. "Trust us." And somehow, despite everything, despite the fact that days ago they had been enemies, despite the decades of conflict between their peoples, he did trust her, completely. Together they waited as the Triarch agents descended the stairwell, their fate balanced on the edge of ancient technology and newfound alliance. The first Triarch agent to reach the laboratory threshold was tall and thin, encased in an environmental suit similar to those they'd seen in the historical footage. The opaque faceplate revealed nothing of the being inside, but the confident stride suggested they expected no resistance. When the agent hit the invisible barrier of the Helix shield, the effect was immediate and satisfying, a flash of blue energy and a startled backward stumble. "It works," Hank whispered, a grin spreading across his face. The agent recovered quickly, reaching for a device at their belt. After a brief scan, they made a series of clicking sounds to their companions, a language neither human nor Viridian. "They're analyzing the shield," Vela warned, her eyes fixed on the monitoring console. "And it's fluctuating. Power levels aren't stable." Hank joined her at the console, where warning indicators flashed across the screen. "How long will it hold?" "Minutes, not hours," she replied grimly. "The power cells are degraded after 30 years of dormancy." Outside the barrier, 3 more Triarch agents had arrived, deploying various devices around the perimeter of the shield. Their methodical approach suggested they were familiar with the technology, perhaps even expecting to find it. "We need an exit strategy," Hank said, scanning the laboratory for options. Vela was already ahead of him, accessing a facility map on a secondary console. "There's a maintenance tunnel system beneath us, originally designed for moving sensitive materials without exposure to the main facility." "Where does it lead?" "Surface access points scattered across a 5-kilometer radius." Her fingers traced a path on the schematic. "This one emerges 3 kilometers east of the hangar, far enough from their ship that we might slip away undetected." A sudden surge of energy from the shield drew their attention. One of the Triarch devices had begun emitting a pulsing beam that visibly distorted the barrier. "They're destabilizing it faster than I anticipated," Vela said, concern evident in her voice. "We have maybe 5 minutes before it fails completely." Hank made a quick decision. "We're taking the prototype with us. It's too valuable to leave behind." "It weighs nearly 100 kilos. "Then we'd better start moving it now." He flashed her a determined smile. "Unless you'd prefer to stay and explain to our friends out there why we've been accessing their sabotage records." Working together, they disconnected the cylindrical device from its base, transferring its core components to a portable containment unit they found in the laboratory storage. The process was complicated by the need to maintain power to the shield while simultaneously preparing the prototype for transport. "Access panel to the tunnels is beneath that workstation," Vela directed, her royal training evident in the calm authority of her voice. Hank moved the station aside, revealing a hatch in the floor. As he worked to open it, a thunderous crack echoed through the laboratory, the shield beginning to fracture under the Triarch assault. "Time's up," he announced, yanking the hatch open to reveal a dark passage below. Vela finished the final preparations, securing the prototype core in its containment unit and slinging it over her shoulder. The weight made her stagger momentarily, but she quickly adjusted her stance. "Allow me," Hank offered, reaching for the unit. She shook her head stubbornly. "Viridian muscle density is 20% greater than human. I can manage this more efficiently than you can." "Is that so?" he challenged, amused despite their precarious situation. "I could demonstrate more thoroughly when we're not fleeing for our lives," she replied with a suggestive arch of her eyebrow. Another crack from the shield ended their banter. Hank lowered himself into the tunnel first, then helped Vela down with the prototype. They sealed the hatch behind them just as the sound of the shield collapsing reached their ears, followed by the pounding of Triarch footsteps entering the laboratory. The tunnel was narrow and dark, illuminated only by the emergency light on Hank's comm unit. They moved as quickly as possible, Vela leading with the prototype, while Hank guarded their rear, expecting pursuit at any moment. 200 meters to the first junction, Vela whispered, consulting the schematic she'd memorized. Then east for another kilometer. The air in the tunnel was stale but cooler than the hangar had been, a welcome relief after their earlier ordeal. Still, the exertion of their escape soon had both of them perspiring again, their breathing heavy in the confined space. At the junction, they paused briefly to catch their breath. Hank took the opportunity to check his comm unit, hoping to contact his extraction team. "Still no signal down here," he reported. "We'll need to reach the surface before we can call for backup." Vela set down the prototype container, rolling her shoulders to ease the strain. "These tunnels weren't designed for comfort," she observed wryly. "Neither was this planet," Hank replied, wiping sweat from his brow, "though I'm starting to appreciate its catalytic properties." Her silver eyes met his in the dim light, understanding his implication immediately. "Are you suggesting our current partnership would not have formed under more temperate conditions, Lieutenant?" He moved closer, drawn to her despite, or perhaps because of, the danger surrounding them. "I'm suggesting that sometimes adverse conditions reveal what might otherwise remain hidden." The heat of their bodies seemed to intensify the small space between them. Vela's crimson skin glistened with a fine sheen of perspiration, reminding Hank of their first moments in the hangar, how her discomfort had gradually transformed into something entirely different. "A very human perspective," she murmured, her voice dropping to an intimate register. "Viridians believe that true character is revealed not through hardship, but through pleasure." "An interesting philosophy," Hank replied, his hand finding the curve of her waist. "One I'd be eager to explore further." "Would you now?" Her lips curved into a smile that managed to be both regal and mischievous. "Perhaps when we're not in imminent danger of being captured by interstellar war profiteers." A distant sound from the direction they'd come, metal against metal, reminded them of their pursuers. They reluctantly separated, Vela retrieving the prototype while Hank readied his weapon. 1 kilometer east, she confirmed, orienting herself in the junction. "Then we'll need to ascend to a secondary tunnel system." They moved swiftly through the eastern passage, the weight of the prototype and their earlier exertions taking a toll on both of them. By the time they reached the vertical access shaft that would lead them to the upper tunnels, they were breathing hard, their bodies slick with sweat. "Ladies first," Vela suggested with a teasing echo of their earlier exchange. Hank grinned. "Age before beauty." "I'm 93 of your Earth years," she replied casually, securing the prototype to her back with straps from her utility belt. Hank nearly lost his grip on the access ladder. "You're what?" "Viridian lifespans average around 300 of your years," she explained, clearly enjoying his shock. "I'm considered quite young, barely an adult by our standards." "That's..." Hank struggled to process this new information. "That's actually somewhat reassuring. I was beginning to worry I'd seduced a princess. Now I discover I've seduced a teenage princess." She laughed, the sound echoing pleasantly in the tunnel. "Rest assured, Lieutenant, I am fully mature by both our species standards, though I admit your human impulsiveness has its charms." As they climbed the access shaft, Hank found himself contemplating the implications of their physiological differences. If they survived this, if they managed to expose the Triarch conspiracy and end the war, what future could they possibly have together? The thought surprised him with its intensity. Somehow, in the space of a day, this Viridian royal had transformed from enemy to ally to something far more significant. When they reached the upper tunnel system, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but they maintained their pace. According to Vela's mental map, they were now directly beneath the desert surface, less than half a kilometer from the exit point. "Almost there," she encouraged, shifting the prototype's weight once more. Hank nodded, pushing aside his earlier thoughts to focus on their immediate survival. There would be time for contemplating interspecies relationships after they escaped the Triarch agents and delivered their evidence to the proper authorities. assuming, of course, that those authorities weren't also compromised by Triarch influence. A possibility that grew more concerning the more he considered it. As they approached the final stretch of tunnel, a new sound reached them. The distinctive whine of a transport vehicle passing overhead. "That's not Triarch," Vela said, her keen hearing identifying the engine signature. "That's Earth Alliant," Hank finished, recognizing it as well. "My extraction team must have decided to risk the storm remnants." Hope surged through them, giving renewed energy to their tired muscles. The exit was close now, their escape nearly complete. Yet as they hurried toward freedom, neither could shake the feeling that their journey together was only just beginning. The surface access hatch was located beneath an outcropping of rust-colored rock, cleverly disguised to blend with the natural terrain. Hank pushed it open cautiously, sand cascading down as he created a gap just wide enough to survey their surroundings. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Firefight," he reported tersely, dropping back down beside Vela. "My extraction team landed about 100 meters east, but they're pinned down by Triarch forces." Vela's expression hardened. The agents from the facility must have called for backup. Through the narrow opening, the sounds of energy, weapons, and shouted commands filtered down to them. Hank recognized Captain Harlow's voice among them. His commanding officer was directing the defense, but from the urgency in her tone, they were losing ground. "We can't stay here," Hank decided. "The Triarch will sweep the area once they've dealt with the extraction team, and they'll find this exit. We can't abandon your people either," Vela countered, her royal sense of duty evident despite their precarious position. Hank glanced at the prototype containment unit. "What exactly can this thing do again?" "It creates a selective energy field that can repel or allow matter to pass through based on program parameters." Vela's eyes widened as she followed his thinking. "You want to use it as a weapon?" "I want to use it as a shield," he corrected. "For my team. Can you reconfigure it to project outward instead of creating a bubble around us?" She considered the device thoughtfully. "Theoretically, yes. The emitter array is directional. I could modify the field parameters to create a forward projecting plane instead of a sphere." "Do it," Hank urged, checking his sidearms charge. "I'll cover you." While Vela worked on the prototype, Hank kept watch through the hatch opening. The situation above was deteriorating rapidly. Earth Alliance soldiers had taken cover behind their landed shuttle and nearby rock formations. But the Triarch forces, at least a dozen strong, were advancing methodically, using some kind of portable shield technology to deflect the humans' weapon fire. "Almost ready," Vela announced, her fingers dancing across the prototype's control interface. "I've reconfigured the field projection and keyed it to recognize standard Earth Alliance and Viridian biosignatures as friendly." "Meaning?" "Meaning it will let your people's weapons fire pass through but block the Triarchs?" She smiled grimly. "In theory. Good enough for me," Hank said, securing the hatch open. "Ladies first. Age before beauty," she countered with a wink, echoing their earlier banter. Despite the danger, Hank found himself grinning. On 3, 1, 2... They emerged from the hatch in perfect synchronization, Vela activating the prototype as they cleared the opening. A shimmering plane of energy erupted from the device, expanding outward to form a translucent barrier between them and the nearest Triarch agents. "Lieutenant Pierce!" Captain Harlow shouted from her position behind the shuttle. "What the hell is that?" "Friendly fire only, Captain," Hank called back, gesturing for his team to advance behind the shield. "Shoot through it. They can't." To demonstrate, he fired his sidearm through the barrier. The energy bolt passed through unimpeded, striking a Triarch agent who had been advancing confidently behind their own shield. The agent dropped, their personal shield useless against the shot they never expected to penetrate. The Earth Alliance soldiers quickly caught on, moving behind Vela's projected barrier and opening fire on the suddenly vulnerable Triarch forces. The tide of battle shifted instantly. "We need to get to your shuttle?" Vela told Hank as they advanced, her voice strained from the effort of maintaining the prototype's field. "The power core is depleting rapidly." Hank relayed the information to Captain Harlow, who ordered her team to fall back toward the shuttle while maintaining covering fire. The Triarch forces, recognizing their disadvantage, began a strategic retreat toward their own vessel. "They're breaking off," Harlow reported as Hank and Vela reached the shuttle's ramp. "But they're not giving up. They're heading for their ship." "Then we need to leave now." Hank urged, helping Vela aboard with the increasingly unstable prototype. Before they get airborne, the shuttle's interior was cramped but blessedly cool after their ordeal in the hangar and tunnels. As the last of the extraction team boarded and the ramp sealed behind them, Captain Harlow approached Hank with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "You want to explain why you're helping a Viridian prisoner escape, Lieutenant? And what exactly that device is?" Before Hank could respond, the shuttle rocked violently as it lifted off. Through the extra viewport, they could see the Triarch vessel rising in pursuit, its weapon systems charging. "No time for explanations, Captain," Hank said firmly. "That ship cannot be allowed to stop us. The device Lieutenant Nix Talon is holding could end the war, but only if we get it and the evidence we've collected back to Earth Command." Harlow's eyes narrowed. "Lieutenant Nix Talon? The Viridian Royal?" "Seventh daughter of High Counselor Talon," Vela confirmed with a regal nod despite her exhaustion. "And yes, this prototype could end the war, because the war was engineered by the Triarch Collective 30 years ago. We have proof." Another blast rocked the shuttle as the Triarch vessel scored a glancing hit on their shields. "Shields at 60%, the pilot called out. "We can't take much more of this." Vela studied the prototype, which was now emitting an alarming whine. "The power core is destabilizing. It wasn't designed for the modifications I made." "Can you stabilize it?" Hank asked, steadying himself against the bulkhead as the shuttle executed evasive maneuvers. "Not without proper equipment," she admitted. "But, there might be another option." Her gaze shifted to the shuttle's engineering panel. "If we integrate the prototype with your ship's power systems, we could project the shield around the entire vessel." Captain Harlow intervened. "You want to connect an experimental alien device to my shuttle?" "Absolutely not." "With all due respect, Captain," Hank countered, "we don't have a choice. That Triarch ship outguns us, and they're determined to prevent us from revealing their conspiracy." Another hit, more violent than the last, made the decision for them as warning lights flashed across the command console. "Shields at 30%, the pilot reported. "One more direct hit, and we're done." "Do it," Harlow ordered grimly, gesturing toward the engineering panel. Working together with the shuttle's engineer, Hank and Vela quickly integrated the prototype into the ship's power grid. The process was delicate and dangerous, requiring Vela's knowledge of the device and Hank's familiarity with Earth Alliance technology. As they worked, their hands occasionally brushed, each contact a reminder of the connection they'd forged in the abandoned hangar. Despite the chaos around them, Hank found himself drawing strength from her presence, her determination, her brilliance, her unwavering courage. "Ready," Vela announced finally, her finger poised over the activation control. "But I should warn you, I have no idea what will happen when we activate it. The prototype was never designed for this kind of application." "Shields at 15%, the pilot called out desperately. "They're locking weapons for another volley." "Do it," Hank and Harlow said in unison. Vela activated the device. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a surge of energy coursed through the shuttle's systems, and a brilliant blue-white field expanded outward from the hull, enveloping the entire vessel in a shimmering cocoon. The Triarch ship fired, its energy weapons impacting the newly formed barrier and dissipating harmlessly against it. "It's working!" the engineer exclaimed, checking his readings. "Their weapons can't penetrate." But the prototype wasn't finished. As they watched in amazement, the shield began to pulse, sending waves of energy back toward the Triarch vessel. The enemy ship shuddered under the assault, its own shield flickering and failing. "It's not just blocking their attacks," Vela realized, studying the readouts. "It's reflecting the energy back at them, amplified." The Triarch vessel veered away, attempting to escape the unexpected counterattack, but the damage was already done. Its engines sputtered and failed, leaving it drifting in Ferrix 9's thin upper atmosphere. "Set course for Earth Command," Captain Harlow ordered, a new respect in her voice as she regarded Hank and Vela. "And prepare a secure transmission. I think High Command is going to want to hear about this immediately." As the shuttle accelerated away from the planet, leaving the disabled Triarch ship behind, Hank found a moment of relative privacy with Vela near the engineering station. "So," he began, his voice low enough for only her to hear, "what happens now, Princess?" Her silver eyes met his, warmth and mischief dancing in their depths. "Now, Lieutenant Pierce, we changed the course of interstellar history." She moved closer, her body radiating a pleasant heat that had nothing to do with Ferrix 9's climate. And after that, I believe you mentioned something about brilliant human-viridian combinations worth exploring. Hank smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of silver hair behind her pointed ear. I did, didn't I? Though I should warn you, humans have significantly shorter lifespans than viridians. I might only have another 60 or 70 years in me. Then we'd better not waste any time, she replied, her fingers intertwining with his. After all, it was the heat that brought us together in the first place. It would be a shame to let that fire cool. As the shuttle carried them toward Earth and the promise of peace between their peoples, Hank reflected on the strange twist of fate that had transformed a routine prisoner transport into the most important mission of his life. All because an alien girl had been sweating and overheating and had to take off some clothes. Sometimes he decided the universe had a peculiar sense of humor, and sometimes that was exactly what was needed to change everything.